Hello, I'm Travis Morgan. I'm 32 years old and currently working as a lawyer at a prestigious law firm in New York City, a bustling metropolis where skyscrapers tower over the clouds and where the energy of life never falters, even in the deepest darkness. New York is a complex symphony intertwined with the constant honking of horns, dazzling neon lights, and grandiose dreams. It's a unique place where, if you're brave and determined enough, you can embrace any identity you dream of. But no matter how much I belong to the glittering chaos of this city, my heart always turns to one person, my grandmother, Elizabeth Morgan, the unique woman who shaped me into who I am today. As I sit in the comfort of my 27th floor apartment right now, gazing out the window at the Hudson River, shimmering with light like a necklace, memories of my grandmother flash through my mind like a nostalgic film reel, filled with color and emotion. She wasn't just another family member to me. She was an unwavering beacon, illuminating my path even through life's harshest storms. She is the chairman of Morgan Hartfield, a Dallas, Texas-based private aviation and luxury transportation empire. But in my eyes, she was much more than just a famous businesswoman who secured multi-million-dollar contracts or delivered impressive speeches on international platforms. To me, she was the magical bedtime storyteller. She patiently taught me how to tie my shoelaces and never lost her gentle smile, even when the world seemed to have turned its back on her. My grandmother taught me countless things about the outside world. She instilled in me philosophies of life and an unwavering work ethic. She always emphasized that money and power were merely means, not ends. A person is not measured by the amount of money in their bank account, but by how they treat those less fortunate, she used to say. When I was just 16, I curiously asked him why he hadn't fired an employee who had made an unforgivable mistake that cost the company millions of dollars. He looked at me with those stern yet compassionate eyes and replied, "Because he has a family to support, and he deeply regrets the mistake he made, Travis." Mistakes don't define a person. What truly makes them valuable is how they learn from them and get back on their feet. These and similar lessons led me to become a lawyer. Just as he championed the values he believed in throughout his life, I, too, wanted to be a relentless defender of justice. I chose the law profession not to make money, but to achieve something meaningful. Just as he founded Morgan Hartfield, not just to generate profit, but to employ thousands and provide a safe and luxurious travel experience for millions of travelers. He is my ideal role model. He is the inspiration behind my tireless work late into the night. He is the true reason I never give up, no matter how tough things get. I have an indescribable admiration for my grandmother. She is not only a talented and successful woman, but also that special person who, when she's around, has a warm heart and a steely will when it's needed. She's the only person in my family who has ever made me feel unconditionally loved. She never tried to force me into a specific mold, but she always expressed her belief that I could achieve anything. The day I graduated from law school with honors, she said, "You are my pride." Those words are the most precious treasure I hold in the deepest corner of my heart. As I sat in my quiet apartment, a sudden wave of unbearable longing washed over me. It had been 2 months since I last visited her in Dallas. The intensity of work, the back-to-back lawsuits, and the relentless pace of life in New York had caused me to repeatedly postpone my planned trip. I promised myself I would definitely get on a plane this weekend. I longed to sit next to her, to hear her stories of the old days, to see her genuine smile, and to feel the warmth of her hand again. But all these longings vanished like morning mist with that unexpected phone call from my father, plunging me into the eye of a storm I was completely unprepared for. When the phone rang, the heavy silence of my apartment shattered like glass. My father's number appeared on the screen. My heart began to race, fearful of receiving bad news. When I answered, my father's voice was cold and filled with concern. "Travis, your grandmother has had a stroke. You need to come to Dallas immediately. Now." I stood frozen, phone in hand. The world around me seemed to stop for a moment. My grandmother, the strong, invincible woman I envisioned, had suffered a stroke. Now she was in a hospital, struggling on the thin line between life and death. Before I even had a chance to think, I hurriedly stuffed a few things into my bag, booked the earliest flight I could find, and raced to the airport in the middle of the night. On the plane to Dallas, huddled in my seat, my mind blank, I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Would I make it in time to tell her how much I loved her? The flight was nearly 3 hours, but it felt like an eternity. As I gazed out the window at the snow-white clouds floating beneath the pale moonlight, a heavy feeling of helplessness settled in my chest. I tried to imagine my grandmother, her gentle smile, her sharp, intelligent eyes, and her warm voice. But these fond memories were quickly replaced by terrifying images of her lying motionless in a hospital bed, surrounded by IVs and constantly beeping machines. I began to blame myself. Why had I let work consume me so much? Why hadn't I visited her more often? Those brief phone calls and hastily written messages could never replace those precious moments I'd spent with her. It was almost dawn when the plane touched down at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. Ignoring the biting cold of the Texas morning and the heavy fatigue weighing down my eyelids, I hopped in a taxi straight to the hospital. I had only one thought. I had to reach her. Baylor Hospital, where she was being treated, loomed before me like a vast, cold, and alien structure. The pungent smell of antiseptic burned my throat as I sped through the corridors. When I pushed open the door to the intensive care unit waiting room, my heart was hammering in my chest. My father, David Morgan, stood there, his arms folded, his gaze fixed on the pristine white wall. He was wearing a gray suit, his hair neatly combed, but I noticed his shoulders were trembling slightly, as if he were trying to calm some inner turmoil. Next to him, my Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother and Morgan Hartfield's HR director, was talking quietly with his wife, Evelyn. Aunt Evelyn, with her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun and bright red lipstick on her lips, looked as if she'd just stepped out of a fancy gala rather than a hospital bed. They didn't notice me right away, and I didn't want to attract their attention. I just wanted to know how my grandmother was doing. When my father saw me, his voice was low and dry. "Travis," he said, "you're home." "How?" I asked, abandoning all courtesy. My heart practically stopped as I waited for his answer. My father sighed deeply, his eyes averting from mine. "The doctor said he had a very serious stroke. He's in intensive care right now. They're doing everything they can, but—" My father paused as if he didn't want to continue the sentence. "But what?" I asked, unable to stop my voice from trembling. "He only has a 20% chance of survival," Uncle Robert interjected, his voice expressionless and cold as if he were reading a business report. "And even if he wakes up, he'll probably be in a vegetative state. The brain damage is extensive." The words were like an icy dagger driven into my heart. I stumbled, clutching the wall to steady myself. In a vegetative state. My grandmother, who had ruled an empire, who had stood fearlessly before thousands of shareholders, would now lie there, never speaking again, never smiling again. I couldn't accept this. I wouldn't. "Where's the doctor? I want to see the doctor now," I said, trying to suppress the tremor in my voice. Evelyn put her hand on my shoulder, her smile soft but not genuine. "Travis, calm down, please. We're all very worried. The doctor will be out in a minute." I pushed his hand away, not needing any comfort. I didn't need empty words. I needed my grandmother. I needed to know she was going to be okay. I walked to the glass window and looked into the intensive care unit, but all I could see were the vague silhouettes of nurses bustling around. I wasn't allowed in, and that made me feel like I was being excluded from her life. The next few hours passed in a daze. I sat on a hard plastic chair in the waiting room, my head in my hands, trying to block out the painful memories that flooded through me. I remembered the last time I'd seen her, 2 months ago, at her mansion in Dallas. She was wearing an emerald green sweater and sitting in an armchair, excitedly telling me about her plans to expand Morgan Hartfield into the Asian market. Even in her 70s, she was still sharp, still passionate. How could everything change so quickly? It felt like my entire world had suddenly fallen apart overnight. One by one, the other members of the Morgan family began arriving at the hospital, like actors stepping onto the stage of a drama I had never wanted to be a part of. My Aunt Charlotte, my father and Uncle Robert's youngest sister, had flown in from France, wearing an expensive silk dress and a strong perfume. Her husband Philippe walked beside her, polite but reserved as always. They hugged me and whispered comforting words, but I could see the insincerity in their eyes. Their air was cold, as if they were assessing the situation from their own perspective rather than grieving. My father was constantly on the phone, talking to the company's shareholders and the press. I heard him talk about controlling the narrative to keep the stock price from falling. I wanted to shout that now wasn't the time to be thinking about work, but I held it back. I didn't want to argue. Now wasn't the time. Uncle Robert and Evelyn were huddled in a corner, whispering. When the word will crossed my mind, my heart ached all over again. Was this really what they were thinking? While my grandmother was still fighting for her life, anger bubbled up inside me, but I tried to suppress it. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe they were worried too, in their own way. The doctor finally appeared. He was a middle-aged man with a tired face but a calm voice. He took my father and me into a small conference room and detailed my grandmother's condition. Mrs. Morgan has suffered a very serious brain hemorrhage. We've done everything we can to stabilize her, but the damage is extensive. If she can make it through the next 48 hours, we might have more hope. But honestly, even if she wakes up, the chances of a full recovery are, sadly, very slim. My throat tightened. So she'll never be the same again? The doctor nodded slowly. We'll do everything we can, but you have to prepare for the worst. When I left the meeting room, my legs felt heavy as lead. My father patted my shoulder, but the touch didn't bring any comfort. He simply said, "We have to be strong, Travis. Your grandmother wouldn't want to see you falling apart like this." But I didn't want to be strong. I wanted to cry, to scream, to do something to pull him out of that limbo between life and death. I returned to the waiting room, sat down, and tried to breathe deeply, but the memories continued to flow like an uncontrollable flood. I remembered the walks I'd taken with my grandmother in the rose garden on summer mornings. She'd point out each flower and tell me its meaning. Red roses are for love, Travis, and white roses are for sincerity and innocence. I remembered how she'd taken his thin but warm hand, squeezing it as if making a silent promise to always be there for me. Now, as he lay in intensive care, I felt like I'd lost a piece of my soul. Had I shown him enough love? Would I forever regret those times when I'd been too busy to visit him? I pulled out my phone and opened a photo from our last trip to Aspen. She was standing on a mountainside, her scarf fluttering in the wind, her smile radiating like the sun. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I scrolled. The atmosphere in the waiting room grew heavy. Almost the entire Morgan family was there. Whispers began to rise, and I realized something chilling. They weren't just talking about her health. They were talking about the future of the company, the assets, the power. I heard Charlotte mention the will to Philip, her voice low but sharp. Uncle Robert was asking my father what the leadership structure would be if the worst-case scenario happened. Evelyn interjected with her fake smile, "We need to unite to save the company, right?" As I sat there listening, my skin crawled. While my grandmother was still fighting for her life, they had already begun dividing up her inheritance. I wanted to stand up and yell at them all, but I restrained myself. I didn't want to turn this waiting room into a battleground, especially now when he needed me most. I stood up and walked into the hallway, looking for breathing space. I promised myself I would never let them drag me into their dirty games. I was his personal lawyer, the one person he entrusted with his most important legal documents. I knew what she wanted in her will, but I wouldn't say a word. Now wasn't the time. All I wanted was to be there, holding her hand, praying for a miracle. That night, memories of my grandmother came flooding back to me like waves crashing onto the shore. I remembered those days when I was a little boy, wide-eyed and curious, holding my grandmother's hand tightly during our world travels. Every summer, she'd take me on the family's private jet, a stunning Gulfstream G650 with pristine leather seats and polished walnut paneling, and let me explore new horizons. When we landed in Paris, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower in awe, she told me how, when she was a student at the Sorbonne, she'd fallen in love with a poor artist but had never dared to confess it to him. One day, we flew to Rome, and as I ate my first gelato on the Spanish steps, she sat next to me, watching me with loving eyes. Travis, he once said, life is like a flight. Sometimes it's calm, sometimes it's turbulent, but the important thing is to always stay in control. 2 winters ago, he took me skiing in Aspen. I still remember the sharp chill of snowflakes hitting my nose and his infectious laugh as I tumbled down a slope. He never let me feel like a failure. Instead of scolding me, he took my hand, pulled me up, and as he brushed the snow from my jacket, he said, "Falling isn't scary, Travis. What's scary is not having the courage to try again." Those words have remained an anchor in my mind throughout my life, a compass guiding me through every challenge. But not everything in my family was as perfect as the moments I spent with him. The extended Morgan family was a complex world of gossip, ambition, and secret dealings. My father, his eldest son, David Morgan, was the vice president of the company. He was a stern man who always placed high expectations on me. But when he saw how close I was to my grandmother, I could sense a tinge of jealousy. My father's younger brother, Uncle Robert, was the HR director. He always appeared kind and loving, but I knew how skillfully he concealed his ambitions. My father's youngest sister, Aunt Charlotte, lived in France with her husband Philippe, a French businessman. She rarely returned to the United States, but whenever she did, she created an atmosphere of tension, as if in silent competition with her siblings. I always consciously avoided them, not because I hated them, but because I sensed a profound insincerity in their behavior toward each other, and sometimes even toward my grandmother. They would come to family gatherings with fake smiles, but I always noticed those questioning looks and suggestive remarks. I didn't want to be drawn into this vortex. To me, family meant my grandmother. It was the warm moments spent with her, not the silent struggles for power or money. My grandmother was aware of this. One quiet evening, as we sat together by the fire, she said to me, "Travis, family isn't always a place where you feel safe. But even if they disappoint you, you have to learn to love them." I didn't fully grasp the meaning of those words at the time, but I sensed the fleeting sadness in her voice. Perhaps she had already recognized those deep cracks in our family, but had chosen to remain silent. Just as she had always chosen forgiveness over confrontation. Now, standing in that cold hospital corridor, amidst the acrid smell of antiseptic and the incessant beeps from the intensive care unit, my grandmother's words echoed in my mind. The cracks she had once hinted at were no longer small fissures. They had become chasms, and I was witnessing my family quietly transform the hospital waiting room into an informal meeting room, where everyone was scheming and vying for power before my grandmother even woke up. After the doctor gave me an update on her condition, I returned to the waiting room. There were no new developments, just the usual assurances that they were keeping a close eye on her. I sat there, trying to focus on praying for her, but the atmosphere in the room was stifling. I forced myself to ignore the stares and whispers, but then Aunt Charlotte stood up and walked over to me. The smile on her face couldn't hide the tension in her eyes. "Travis, how are you, darling?" she asked, her voice sweet but filled with questioning intent. "I know how close you are to your grandmother. You must be very worried." "I'm fine, Aunt Charlotte," I replied, trying to keep my voice as calm as possible. "I just want her to wake up soon." "Of course," she nodded and sat down next to me. "But you know, with your grandmother lying there like this, we have to think about the future. The company is working tirelessly, and what she left behind." I froze, feeling like someone had poured a bucket of ice water on me. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Charlotte lowered her voice and moved closer to me. "Travis, you're her personal attorney. You should know about her will, right? I don't want to pressure you, but we need some clarity. If the unexpected happens, the family needs to be prepared." I looked her straight in the eye, trying to keep my anger in check. "Aunt Charlotte, my grandmother is still alive. I don't think now is the time to talk about her will." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're right, Travis, but facts are facts. We can't stay naive forever." I turned away, not wanting to continue talking. But before I could stand up, my father came to me and put his hand on my shoulder. "Travis, come with me for a minute," he said firmly. Reluctantly, I stood up and followed him into the hallway. "You're my son," he began, his voice low but filled with pressure. I know you know something about your grandmother's assets and what she's planning for the company. The family needs to stand together now more than ever. You need to be on my side to support me." "What do you mean, take your side? What do you want me to do?" I asked, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. My father sighed deeply, as if I were making things more difficult than necessary. "Travis, don't be so naive. If your grandmother doesn't survive, or if she can no longer run the company, there will be huge changes. The shareholders will want answers. We need to make sure Morgan Hartfield stays in the family's hands, and I keep it. You're a lawyer. You know how complicated these things can be." I looked at my father, whom I once admired but now felt like a stranger. "Dad, she's still struggling inside. I don't want to think about the company or the will. I just want to pray for her survival." He frowned, his gaze icy. "Travis, do you think your grandmother would want you to just sit there and pray? She built an empire, and she would want us to protect it. You have to pick a side, Travis, or you're out of this game." Her words hit me like a punch in the chest. Picking a side, family. I felt like I was being dragged into a game I never wanted to be a part of. Without answering, I turned and walked back to the waiting room. But the atmosphere there had completely changed. The whispered conversations were now more open. Insinuations had given way to direct statements. I heard Uncle Robert say to Evelyn, "If the will isn't clear, we have to act very quickly. We can't let everything fall into the hands of strangers." Evelyn nodded, and when her eyes fell on me, she looked at me as if I were an obstacle to be cleared. I felt like I was surrounded by vultures. They knew I was my grandmother's personal lawyer, the only person privy to her most important legal documents. I had helped her draft the will and read every clause she had written with the love and care she felt for her family. But now I realized her love meant nothing to them. All they wanted was their share, their stocks, control of the real estate, and I, being the person closest to her, became the focus of their suspicions and pressure. The following days were an endless series of indirect interrogations and pressures. Each family member tried different ways to get information from me: promises, veiled threats, or emotional blackmail. My father spoke of my duty as a son. Uncle Robert spoke of my responsibility to his legacy. Evelyn tried to soothe me with stories about family ties, which I knew to be hollow. Only my memories of my grandmother and me were real. But the family's presence in the hospital didn't last long. Just 3 days later, the atmosphere in the waiting room changed. My father, David, received a call from the company, and I heard him mention an urgent shareholders meeting. He tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Travis, I have some business to attend to at the company. You stay here with your grandmother and keep me updated." Then, without a backward glance, he left. Uncle Robert and Evelyn didn't stay long either. They left the hospital at the end of the second day, leaving me with a deep sense of emptiness and bitterness. Aunt Charlotte and Philip disappeared even faster. And so the hospital fell into an awkward silence. But this silence only deepened my loneliness. I was the only one left. I kept vigil in front of the glass window of the intensive care unit where my grandmother lay. I didn't leave. I didn't want to. Every day I'd sit in that hard plastic chair, clutching her sweater tightly. The faint scent of roses and sandalwood still lingered in my nose. I'd whisper to her through the glass, telling her about my days in New York, the cases I'd won, the dreams I'd never shared with anyone. "Grandma, I'm here," I'd say, my voice muffled. "I'm not going anywhere." The days passed in an agonizing wait. The doctors always gave me the same information. "She's stable, but there's no progress." They told me her chances of waking up were slim and that I should prepare for the worst. But I couldn't accept it. I couldn't imagine a world without my grandmother, who taught me to get back up every time I fell, who gave me a purpose to become a lawyer, who always believed in me unconditionally. I slept in hospital chairs, munched on food from vending machines, and ignored every call from my law firm in New York. Work could wait, but Grandma couldn't. I didn't want to miss a moment. I didn't want to miss the chance of seeing her open her eyes. Every night, I held her sweater, finding solace in her familiar scent. Sometimes I felt she could hear me, fighting within herself to come back. Then on the morning of her second week in the hospital, a miracle occurred. I was sitting at the window, my head bowed, my eyes blurry from lack of sleep, when a nurse rushed to me, her face frantic but hopeful. "Mr. Morgan, the doctor wants to see you right away. Miss Elizabeth, she's awake." My heart nearly stopped. I jumped to my feet and followed the nurse, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the intensive care unit, the chief physician was waiting with a rare smile on his face. "She's opened her eyes," he said. "She's very weak, but she's conscious, and she wants you." I walked into the room, tears streaming down my cheeks. Grandma lay there, fragile and pale, the IV needles wrapped around him like threads of fate. But his eyes, those sharp, determined eyes, still shone brightly when they met mine. "Travis," he whispered, his voice quiet but clear, "my beloved grandson." I knelt beside his bed and held his slender hand. "Grandma, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." I wanted to say more, to tell him how scared I was, how much I loved him, but my throat tightened and only silent tears streamed down my cheeks. He smiled, a weak but warm smile, like the first ray of sunshine after a storm. "Don't cry, Travis," he said. "I'm not ready to die yet." I stayed by his side all day, never leaving him. I told him about my days outside the intensive care unit, how I spoke to him through the glass, how I refused to let go even though the whole world tried to tear me away from him. He listened, sometimes nodding slightly, sometimes closing his eyes as if to rest. But I knew he was listening. It felt like old times, just him and me. There was no intrigue, no suspicious glances. That night, he took my hand and pulled me toward him. "Travis," he whispered, his voice more serious this time. "Tell me everything. What happened while I lay here?" I hesitated. I didn't want to upset him. I didn't want to tire him. I didn't want him to know that his family had left after only 3 days, that while he was struggling with death, they had begun to scheme against his will and power. But his sharp, determined eyes made it impossible to hide anything. I sat down and told him everything, one by one. I told him how they'd discussed the will, the shares, the control of the company, as if he were long gone. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his gaze deep and thoughtful. After a long silence, he sighed deeply, his voice low but determined. "Travis, do you remember what I told you? Family isn't always a safe haven." I nodded, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. "I remember." He closed his eyes as if lost in thought. When he opened his eyes again, there was a strange light in them. Not the fragility of someone who had just returned from the dead, but the resolve of someone ready to face the world anew. "Travis," he said, "I want to test them one last time." I was stunned. "Test them? What do you mean?" His smile was both gentle and sharp, the same kind he used to give his boardroom rivals. "I want to know who they really are when they think I'm no longer in control. You'll help me, won't you?" I nodded, even though I didn't fully understand his plan, but as always, I trusted him implicitly. "I'll do whatever you ask." He squeezed my hand, his voice hard. "Good. Now listen carefully. You'll make up a fake will. All the assets, the stocks, the property, control of the company. You'll say I'm leaving it all to you. No one else gets a penny." My eyes widened, my heart pounding. "Grandma, are you sure? If I do this, the whole family will turn against me." "I know," he interrupted, his voice calm but commanding, "and that's exactly what I want to see. I want to know what they'll do when they think they've lost everything. You can do this, right?" I swallowed hard, as if I were stepping into a dangerous game, but I nodded. "I'll do it, Grandma." He nodded in satisfaction and then motioned for the doctor. When the doctor arrived, he requested a private meeting with him and a nurse he trusted. As I waited outside, I could hear from the voices inside his plan to pretend he'd lost consciousness again and slipped into a vegetative state. I couldn't believe my ears. My grandmother, just waking from a stroke, was devising such a bold and complex plan to test her own children. That night, I checked into a hotel near the hospital, opened my laptop, and began drafting that forged will. My hands trembled as I wrote each word, but I couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. My grandmother had always been a master strategist, and now she was turning her family into her own chessboard. The will was meticulously drafted, its legalese watertight and its lack of loopholes. All assets, from the Dallas mansion to Morgan Hartfield stock, from Swiss bank accounts to a fleet of private jets, were bequeathed to me, Travis Morgan, with the condition that I immediately assume the role of chairman. As he requested, I sent him the draft via encrypted email. When I returned to the hospital the next morning, he signed the forged will in the presence of his trusted nurse and doctor. He looked at me with a look that was both compassionate and penetrating. "Travis," he said, "things are going to get very difficult from now on, but I trust you. You're the only one I can trust." I nodded, feeling the weight of an immense responsibility. "I won't let you down," he smiled. The doctors and nurse had been instructed to keep the plan secret, and they agreed to it not only out of deep respect for him, but also because of the promise of generous financial support he would provide the hospital after his recovery. The plan had been secretly implemented, and I felt as if I had stepped into a dangerous game in which I was not only a player, but also the one holding the script. When I left intensive care, my heart was heavy but resolute. I knew that if the forged will were revealed, the family would collapse like a roof. I should have been prepared for angry looks, accusations, and even legal battles. But I wasn't afraid, because at my side was my grandmother, the strongest woman I knew, and she was willing to risk everything to see the true colors of those around her. I returned to the hotel with the forged will my grandmother had signed. Although it was just a piece of paper, a fabrication, it was like a ticking time bomb, ready to shatter the masks my family had worn for years. I sat at my laptop, reviewing every sentence, every word, over and over again, ensuring there were no loopholes. I knew that once this came out, all eyes would be on me, and I needed to be prepared for the storm ahead. My grandmother had told me to summon the whole family to the hospital that weekend, under the pretext of sharing important information about her health. I sent emails to my father, Uncle Robert, Aunt Charlotte, and Evelyn, explaining that we needed to meet to discuss something important. I deliberately kept my tone neutral, avoiding any hint of the will, but inside I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. I was stepping into a chess game my grandmother had devised, and I was the one moving the pieces. The only question was, did I have the strength to face what was coming? The weekend came quicker than I'd anticipated. I stood in a small hospital conference room the doctor had arranged for this special family gathering. The air was cold. The strong smell of antiseptic still lingered, and the glow of the fluorescent lights hurt my eyes. I waited at the head of the table, the forged will clutched tightly in my hand. My father arrived first, his gray suit impeccable as always, but his eyes filled with suspicion. "Travis, what's this meeting about?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "I hope you're not about to do anything stupid." I didn't answer, just nodded, gesturing for him to sit down. Uncle Robert and Evelyn arrived later. Evelyn wore a dazzling red dress, as if attending a fancy event rather than a hospital meeting. Robert maintained a calm demeanor, but I noticed his hand gripping the arm of the chair tightly, as if expecting something. Aunt Charlotte and Philip were the last to arrive. She wore an emerald green silk dress, her hair neatly tied back, but the smile on her face didn't hide her nervousness. "Travis, why did you call us here?" she asked, her voice sweet yet questioning. "How's your grandmother?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm. "Thank you all for coming. I know you're busy, but this is important. It's about my grandmother and her will." The atmosphere in the room immediately turned cold. My father's eyes sharpened like a hunter's sensing danger. Evelyn sat up straighter, her smile fading. Charlotte shared a worried look with Philip, and Robert cleared his throat as if to hide his uneasiness. I knew what they were thinking. They'd been waiting for this moment, but none of them had expected it to come so soon. "I am Grandmother Elizabeth's personal attorney," I continued, my voice calm but firm. "Before she was caught up in this situation, she entrusted me with the execution of her will, and now, at her request, I will reveal its contents to you." I opened the envelope, removed the forged will, and began reading. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I forced my voice to remain steady. According to the will prepared and signed by Mrs. Elizabeth Morgan, all assets, including the Morgan Hartfield stock, the Dallas, New York, and other international properties, the bank accounts, and complete control of the company are hereby transferred to her grandson, Travis Morgan, and me, under the condition that I assume the role of chairman of the board. Silence. A deathly silence fell over the room. I looked up and took in the expressions on each family member's face. My father sat motionless, his face pale as if he'd been slapped. Charlotte gripped Philip's hand tightly enough that her nails dug into it. Robert was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling with anger. "What kind of joke is this, Travis? He couldn't have done this. It's impossible." "This isn't a joke," I replied, trying to maintain my composure. "This is a legal will, signed in the presence of 2 witnesses and notarized. I am simply doing my duty." My father jumped to his feet, his chair toppling back with a thud. "Travis, how dare you?" he roared. "How dare you go behind my back and betray me? Do you think you can take everything from me? Do you think you can get away with this?" I met his gaze, feeling my heart break. "Dad, this isn't my decision. This is my grandmother's decision." "My grandmother's decision?" he snapped. "She's lying unconscious in the intensive care unit, Travis. How could she sign this? What did you do? Did you forge the will?" His accusation was as sharp as a knife. I knew he would react like this, but the fact that he called me, an honest lawyer, a fraud, still hurt. "Dad, I didn't forge anything," I said, my voice low but firm. "She signed this will beforehand. I'm simply carrying out her wishes." Charlotte interjected, her voice sharp as a knife. "Travis, do you think we're stupid? He can't possibly leave everything to you. You're just his grandchild, not his child. We're his children. We have our rights." She turned to Philip, as if seeking support. "Philippe, see, this is a fraud." Philippe nodded, his voice calm but cold. "Travis, you'll have to prove the legitimacy of this will. Otherwise, we'll take this matter to court." Evelyn interjected. "Travis, you're tearing this family apart. You realize that, don't you? If you cooperate with us, we can negotiate. Let's divide the assets fairly. There's no need to take this to court." I stood there, surrounded by accusations, angry looks, and threats. But I didn't hesitate for a moment. I thought of my grandmother, the piercing gaze she had when she'd told me to carry out this plan. Even as I lay in the intensive care unit, feigning a vegetative state, I knew she was watching me. I couldn't disappoint her. "I'm not trying to destroy the family," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm doing what my grandmother wants. If you don't agree, you can take this to court. I'm ready." Robert kept wagging his finger at me. "You'll regret this, Travis. Do you think you can stand up to her entire family? We'll have her mental health records reviewed. If she's not of sound mind when she signs this, the will is invalid." His words chilled me to the core. Were they really willing to go this far? To denigrate my grandmother, who had built an empire for them, just to fight for a fortune? Anger welled up inside me, but I held it back. "Do what you think is right," I said coldly, "but I will protect my grandmother's wishes to the very end." The meeting ended in utter chaos. My father stormed out first. He didn't say a word, but his gaze could have seared me. Charlotte and Philip whispered something to each other, their eyes calculating. Robert and Evelyn lingered for a while longer, trying to persuade me to redistribute the assets, but I steadfastly refused. When I left the meeting room, I felt as if I'd just emerged from a battlefield. In the following days, the family became a battleground. My father called, demanding I revoke the will and threatening to hire the country's best lawyers to sue me. Charlotte sent a formal email confirming that she had contacted a prestigious New York law firm to verify its legality. Evelyn, meanwhile, sent me messages pretending to care, but I knew her sole purpose was to leak information. I felt surrounded on all sides, like a hunted animal. But what hurt most wasn't the accusations or threats. It was the realization that my family, the people my grandmother had loved and sacrificed for her entire life, were so easily willing to turn their backs on her and me for money and power. As I sat in my hotel room, gazing at the glittering Dallas skyline, I felt a profound loneliness. I wondered if my grandmother had ever felt this way when she realized her children weren't what she'd hoped they would be. I returned to the hospital every day to check on my grandmother. I kept her informed of important developments, but avoided the most painful details to spare her the pain. He lay there listening, nodding slightly, as if everything that had happened were part of his own calculations. His eyes, though weak, still shone with a sharp intensity, reminding me that he would never be easily defeated. I held his hand, feeling the gentle warmth of his delicate fingers, and vowed to myself that I would not disappoint him. But the storm we had created was growing, and I knew I would soon face greater challenges than ever. Following the disclosure of the forged will, the Morgan family flew into fury. Just 4 days later, I received a formal email from a prestigious Dallas law firm informing me that my father, Uncle Robert, and Aunt Charlotte had filed a lawsuit against me. I was accused of forging the will and exploiting my grandmother's health to seize the family's assets. The accusation was as sharp as a knife. Not only was it aimed at me, but it was also because it had tarnished the deep trust my grandmother had placed in me. I sat in my hotel room, reading that formal letter over and over again, feeling as if the entire world had conspired against me. I called my father, hoping to speak to him directly, but he wouldn't answer. Instead, I received a text message from him. "Travis, you've chosen the wrong side. Don't blame me for the consequences." The message stung. I hadn't chosen a side. I was simply fulfilling my grandmother's wishes, but it seemed to mean nothing to him. The media was quick to pick up on the story. One morning, as I left the hospital for coffee, I saw my name on the front page of a local business newspaper. Morgan Hartfield family squabbles over heir. Grandson accused of seizing aviation empire. The article cited anonymous sources close to the family who claimed that, as my grandmother's personal attorney, I had manipulated the will. They called me an opportunist, a family traitor. I crumpled up the newspaper and threw it in the trash, but the pain of the smear clung to me like a shadow. In the days that followed, I began preparing for the case. I met with a colleague in New York who specializes in probate and estate law. He warned me that if the family could prove that my grandmother was mentally ill at the time the will was signed, they could request a mental capacity evaluation. In that case, the will, even if forged, would be considered invalid. Knowing my grandmother was aware of everything and personally orchestrated the entire scheme, I knew it wouldn't be a problem, but I couldn't reveal the truth. I had to play by her rules. Meanwhile, the Morgan family continued to show their true colors. Evelyn called me, her voice as sweet but calculating as ever. "Travis, there's no need to complicate matters. If you agree to split the assets, we can work this out quietly between ourselves." When I flatly rejected her offer, her tone immediately shifting to a threat that warned me I would lose everything if I continued to resist. Charlotte sent a long letter, recounting childhood memories as if trying to exploit my emotions, but I understood her true intentions. She wanted me to back down. As the court date approached, the pressure mounted. The media continued to report on our family's story, turning it into a public drama. Morgan Hartfield shareholders were asking questions, and the company's stock price was fluctuating dramatically. I received a formal email from a board member requesting clarification on the situation. I briefly stated that everything would be resolved in court, but deep down, I knew I was walking a tightrope. Every night, I returned to my hotel and sat alone in the dark room, staring at the glittering Dallas skyline. I questioned my strength to continue. I struggled not only with my family, but also with my own fears. Fear of hurting my grandmother, fear of failing to protect her legacy. But every morning, returning to the hospital and holding her hand, I found the strength I was searching for. She was the reason I had come here, and I would never give up. The hearing was scheduled for a gloomy, rainy day in Dallas. I entered the courtroom, my black suit spotless but my heart heavy. Inside, the Morgan family was gathered. My father sat in the front row, his gaze icy, avoiding my gaze. Uncle Robert and Evelyn were whispering with their lawyer, a tall man with a confident smile. Aunt Charlotte and Philippe sat in the corner. Charlotte was dressed in a stylish black dress, but the tension in her eyes was evident. The courtroom atmosphere was stifling, as if all my family's anger and passion had been transformed into a poisonous cloud. I sat at the defendant's table next to my lawyer, who had agreed to assist me from New York. "Travis, calm down," he whispered. "Everything is under control." But I wasn't sure I could remain calm. This wasn't just a case. It was a struggle between my loyalty to my grandmother and the betrayal of those closest to me. The family's lawyer launched his defense. He called the will a blatant fraud and accused me of exploiting my grandmother's frail health to forge the document. He presented medical reports that argued she had been mentally unsound at the time she signed the will and requested the court to declare it invalid. Hearing each accusation, I felt as if I had been stripped naked in front of the entire world. But I didn't hesitate. I knew the truth, and I knew my grandmother trusted me. When my turn came, I stood up and declared that the will had been legally signed long before her hospitalization, bearing the signatures of 2 witnesses and a notary. I emphasized that I was merely fulfilling my duty as his personal attorney, but I didn't reveal the true truth, that he was conscious and that this was all part of a plan to test their loyalty. I couldn't tell him because he'd asked me to keep it secret. The hearing dragged on for hours, with heated arguments from both sides. I saw my father's face as if I'd just inflicted the biggest disappointment on him. Charlotte was whispering to Philip repeatedly, her eyes calculating. Robert sat silent, but I knew he was waiting for the right moment to deliver the final blow. As the judge prepared to close the first day of the trial, the rear door of the courtroom banged open. A chilly breeze rushed in. I turned and my heart leapt as I saw my grandmother, Elizabeth Morgan, being wheeled in by a nurse. She was wearing a hospital gown, her face pale, but her eyes, as sharp as ever, scanned the room. The room was filled with shocked whispers. My father stood abruptly, his face pale. Charlotte grasped Philip's hand, her mouth open in surprise, but she couldn't say a word. Robert and Evelyn looked at each other, their eyes wide with fear. The judge, though clearly caught off guard, quickly recovered. He banged his gavel on the table, signaling silence. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice low but respectful, "do you have a statement to present to the court?" My grandmother nodded slightly, her delicate hand gripping the armrest of the wheelchair. Her voice was weak but clear. Each word struck the suffocating silence like a hammer. "Your Honor, I'm not dead yet, but I see that many in my family have long ago lost their integrity." Her words sent a shockwave through the room. I saw my father stagger as if shot in the chest. Charlotte bowed her head, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles were white. Robert coughed, trying to hide his panic, while Evelyn lowered her eyes, as if to escape my grandmother's piercing gaze. I stood there, my heart torn between pride and heartache. My grandmother, barely alive, was still the strongest woman I'd ever known. "I woke up 2 weeks ago," he continued, his voice slow but commanding, "and I heard it all. The accusations, the scheming, the plans to divide my estate while I was still fighting for my life. I asked Travis to make a fake will, to test the hearts of you, my children, one last time, and you have shown me exactly who you are." The courtroom fell into utter silence, the only sound the rhythmic pounding of rain on the windows. I looked at him, my heart filled with a mixture of awe, pain, and a tiny bit of relief. His plan had worked. The family he had loved and sacrificed for his entire life had laid bare their greed and selfishness. He raised his hand and motioned for the nurse to pull out a small USB drive. His voice was cold as steel. "I recorded everything. The conversations at the hospital, the will, the stocks, those whispers about power. I want the court to review these videos and see with their own eyes how these people, who call themselves my family, acted when they thought I was dead." The nurse connected the USB drive to the projector in the courtroom. A large screen lit up, and images began to play. I saw again the hospital waiting room where the family had gathered for those 2 short days. I heard my father whisper on the phone to a financial advisor, "If he doesn't wake up, we have to act very quickly. We can't let Travis take everything." I saw Charlotte speaking harshly to Philippe, "We have to get a lawyer now. Travis can't take everything." I heard Robert tell Evelyn, "If the will leaves everything to Travis, we'll review my mother's mental health records. She couldn't have been sane when she signed it." Each image was like a knife thrust into my heart. I knew they were planning, but seeing them so openly discussing dividing my grandmother's estate, slandering her, filled me with both anger and profound disappointment. I looked at my family and for the first time saw shame on their faces. My father bowed his head and covered his face with his hands. Charlotte bit her lip, fighting back tears. Robert shook his head as if he couldn't believe he'd been caught. My grandmother continued, her voice steady. 2 years ago, I prepared a genuine will, signed by lawyers and a notary. In it, I divided my estate equally among my children, David, Robert, and Charlotte, but with certain conditions. You had to prove your worthiness, not only through your talent, but also through your loyalty and love for this family. But what I saw today shows what a grave mistake I made in trusting you. My father stood up, his voice trembling. "Mom, I was just trying to protect the company." "Enough, David," my grandmother interrupted, her voice sharp. "Were you protecting the company or your own interests? You left the hospital after just 2 days and left Travis all alone. You sued your own son, calling him a fraud, because you were afraid of losing what you thought you deserved." My father fell silent, sat back down, unable to meet my grandmother's gaze. I saw his eyes gleam, but I wasn't sure if it was from remorse or simply humiliation. My grandmother turned to Charlotte. "Charlotte, you came all the way from France, but the moment you thought you had nothing left to gain, you left. Instead of staying with me, you hired a lawyer to sue your own niece." Charlotte opened her mouth to speak, but then she stopped talking and bowed her head. Finally, she looked at Robert and Evelyn. "Robert, you were the one I had the most hopes for, but you were willing to delve into my mental health records to get what you wanted. And you, Evelyn, constantly encouraged your husband in ways I thought I didn't know I knew about." Evelyn burst into tears, but she found no sympathy from anyone in the room. They had gotten themselves into this situation, and now they had to face the consequences. My grandmother turned to me, her gaze instantly softening. "When you all left, the only person who stayed with me every day was Travis. Travis never asked a single question about the will, never made any plans. So in my true will, I entrusted Travis with the leadership and oversight of Morgan Hartfield. Not because I don't love you, but because I know Travis will protect this legacy I've built, not just for my family, but for the thousands of people who work at this company." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I fought to hold them back. I didn't want possessions or power. I just wanted my grandmother to be proud of me, and I knew she would always trust me now. After reviewing the videos, the judge immediately dismissed my case. He also confirmed that my grandmother's true will, drafted 2 years ago, was legal and binding. The Morgan family had nothing left to contest. They had lost not only in court, but also in their own consciences. When the hearing ended, my grandmother asked to be taken back to the hospital. I walked beside her, holding her hand, feeling as if I'd just woken from a nightmare. She looked at me in the car, a faint smile on her face. "Travis, you did well," she said. "I knew you wouldn't let me down." I leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I just want you to get better," I whispered. "I don't need anything else." She squeezed my hand tighter, her eyes shining. "You are my true legacy, Travis." As I left the courtroom, I saw my father standing alone in the hallway, his gaze distant. Charlotte and Philip had left without a word. Robert and Evelyn had run to their cars, as if they were running from the truth. That family, once united under my grandmother's guidance, had fallen apart, leaving only the remnants of greed and betrayal behind. I drove my grandmother back to the hospital, my heart aching and relieved. I was relieved that the truth had come out, but I ached because my family had destroyed itself. Yet, with my grandmother, I knew I had done the right thing, and that was all I needed at that moment. The Dallas rain continued to fall relentlessly, blanketing the city in a gray fog, as if trying to hide the shattered remains of the Morgan family. The soft thrum of the wheelchair mingled with the sound of the rain outside as I wheeled my grandmother through the hospital corridor. She was silent, her eyes staring off into the distance, as if replaying the events of the courtroom. I wanted to ask how she felt, to see if she was as heartbroken as I was, but I didn't dare. I feared the truth had hurt her far more than she realized. In the days following the hearing, the consequences spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The Morgan Hartfield Board of Directors held an emergency meeting, and as my grandmother's appointee to oversee the company, I was invited to attend. I sat at the head of the meeting table, under the watchful, questioning gaze of the shareholders. They had watched the videos shown in court and read the articles about the Morgan Hartfield family feud. They no longer trusted my father and Uncle Robert. An elderly shareholder who had worked with my grandmother since the company's early days stood up and spoke bluntly. David and Robert allowed greed to cloud their judgment. "We need new leadership. People who prioritize the company's interests over personal gain." The meeting concluded with a nearly unanimous decision. My father and my uncle, Robert, were stripped of all their leadership roles at Morgan Hartfield. My father, once a vice president, and Robert, once the HR director, were now mere figures on the shareholder list, stripped of their power. I watched my father leave the meeting room. His shoulders slumped, the confident look in his eyes gone. He seemed to have lost everything that defined him. I wanted to run after him to comfort him, but I couldn't. After what he had done, it was impossible. He had sued me, called me a fraud, and most importantly, abandoned my grandmother at a critical moment when she needed him most. Charlotte and Philip practically vanished from Dallas immediately after the hearing. He sent me a short message. "Travis, I'm sorry. I hope you'll forgive me someday." I read it, but didn't respond. I didn't know if I could forgive him, not because I was angry, but because I no longer considered him family. My family was just my grandmother to me. Robert and Evelyn soon left Dallas and moved to an apartment in Houston, far from the prying eyes of the media and the whispers of the business world. Evelyn called me once, her voice trembling, saying she just wanted to make things right. But once trust was broken, I didn't know how anything could be fixed. I simply said, "Evelyn, have a good life with Robert. That's what Grandma would have wanted." Then I hung up, feeling as if I'd closed the door forever. The Morgan family, once a symbol of unity and success, had completely disintegrated. There were no more elegant tea parties or lavish family vacations to Aspen or Europe. We had stopped talking, like strangers who had crossed paths for a brief moment in life. I didn't know if we would ever reconcile, but for now, I had no hope of it. At my grandmother's request, I took over the interim leadership of Morgan Hartfield. The job wasn't easy. I faced tense meetings, endless questions from shareholders, and relentless pressure from a media that refused to let our family's story be forgotten. But every day, I visited the hospital, sat next to my grandmother, and told her about my day's work. Her eyes sparkled with pride, and she smiled. "Travis," she said once, her voice weak but warm, "you're the only person I trust to continue this structure I've built." Those afternoons with her became a source of healing for me. We didn't talk about the case or the family, just simple things like how she taught me to tie my shoes or how to brew tea the perfect English. We kept that test of loyalty a secret. It forged a special bond between us. It was a testament to how we protected each other, how we preserved what remained of our family bond. My grandmother slowly recovered, but the doctor said she would never be as strong again. But she faced it with the serene grace I had always admired. "Travis," she said one day, sitting at a hospital window overlooking the garden, "life isn't about living forever, it's about living right." I nodded, took his hand, and felt a peace I hadn't felt in weeks. But I still carried a wound inside me. My family had fallen apart. While I didn't regret my actions, it hurt to think of my father, Charlotte, Robert, and Evelyn. I wondered if they had any regrets or if they continued their lives with the same greed and selfishness. I had no answers, and perhaps I never would. I sat in my new office at Morgan Hartfield's headquarters, gazing out at the dazzling Dallas skyline. A portrait of my grandmother hung on the wall. Her eyes in the portrait watched me with a look both gentle and stern. Every time I looked at it, I remembered her voice, her lessons, and the courageous test of loyalty that had changed everything. I stood up and went out onto the balcony, feeling the cool night breeze brush against my face. A sense of peace washed over me. Not because I had won the family war, but because I had been able to protect the one I loved most. I wasn't rich because of the fortune my grandmother left behind. I was rich because of the invaluable lessons she had taught me about human nature in her final days. She had shown me that family wasn't just about blood. It was about loyalty, love, and those moments when you're willing to sacrifice for others without expecting anything in return. My grandmother had founded Morgan Hartfield not just to make money, but to leave a legacy of trust, honesty, and responsibility. And now it fell to me to carry on that legacy, not just for her, but for everyone who worked at the company and believed in me. I thought of my father, Charlotte, Robert, and Evelyn. They were now mere shadows in my life. I didn't hate them, but I no longer had any hope of reconciliation. Maybe one day we would reunite, talk, and find a way to heal our wounds. But for now, I focused on what my grandmother had taught me, to live righteously, to love sincerely, and to never let greed blind me. Every afternoon, I continued to go to the hospital with a bouquet of her favorite white roses. I would sit next to her and tell her about the company, my new plans, and the dreams I was pursuing. She would listen, smile, and sometimes hold my hand, as if to tell me she was still there, still my guiding lighthouse. One evening, as the sunset light bathed the hospital grounds in gold, my grandmother looked at me, her eyes shining as brightly as they had in those days. "Travis," she said, "you are my true legacy. Not the company, not the money, but you. You are a man who knew how to love and be faithful." I leaned over and kissed her forehead, tears streaming silently down my cheeks. "I love you, Grandma," I whispered. "Thank you for everything." As we left the hospital, I gazed up at the star-filled night sky. Dallas retained its vibrant vibrancy, its constant movement, but in my heart there was only a stillness. I had lost family, but I had preserved what was most important, my grandmother's love and trust, and that was my most precious legacy.